We're here for part 2 of the book of Psalms. We're in chapter 4. You can watch part 1. I have it posted on my Facebook page, Eddie Pastor Devalle, and With Love Ministries. And we're right at chapter 4, verse 4. We're going to pick up there. But just a background again on what we're studying here with Psalms. And we're talking about specifically David, one of the characters that's written extensively. He's not the only one who's written in the Psalms, but particularly what we're covering right now is about David. So I want to talk about 3 and 4 of Psalms. Both those chapters, David is showing us, he's demonstrating things that happened throughout his life and his kingship when he was King David. He was the leader of the Israel battle. He was their king, their general, and he was quite a leader. But he ran into some problems personally, character flaws, character issues, and decision making. And the thing about David we have to understand is that God made a covenant with him, and it was an unconditional covenant. Now, not everyone has this unconditional covenant. That this covenant says that no matter what happened between David and Israel, that covenant would be fulfilled. It's called the Davidic covenant, and basically it says that through David would come the King of Israel, which is Jesus Christ. That covenant would give the opportunity for David to prepare for the temple to be built, and then to give over his leadership to his son Solomon. But through that line, the promise would be that Jesus would come through David. And of course, not through natural birth or anything like that, but just through the order, God's order. And so that's something that must have been in David's mind because God had made that covenant with him. And so, you could see he's going 2 steps forward, 1 step back throughout his life and throughout his tenure as King David. But his heart was in the right place. He was a man after God's own heart. And so I'm sure, knowing that covenant, he didn't want to mess up. And I'm sure you wouldn't, and I wouldn't either, if it was that high of a calling. But you do have a high calling, by the way. It is a calling in our lives. You may not lead a nation or a church or a ministry, but you still have Jesus there as the testimony, as David did. So that's your high calling, is to emulate and follow Christ. Now, we reviewed last time in Psalm 3 and the beginning of chapters 4, 1 through 4, we reviewed how David had issues with his son. His son was trying to become king without being appointed, and he was backstabbing his father. He was manipulating, gossiping, backstabbing, and conniving and scheming. He wanted power. And his son was also in trouble with God because he instructed some of his men to murder his stepbrother for rape of his sister. I know that sounds weird, but that's what happened back in those days. There was interrelationships in marriage. At this point, the law was established, but people still did things, and that included fornication and sexual immorality. So through that, David writes these psalms with burden about his son. He's burdened about the people of Israel. He's burdened about the enemy in war, the Philistines, the Jebusites. All these leaders in battles are weighing on David. And on top of that, he's king. And so he's looking to settle and be in his palace, in his domain. But there's a lot of things in the way. So he writes here, the psalmist writes about David's experience. Now, something happened in one of these battles. And one of those things included in all the drama I've shared with you is he had a military, and it was quite large. They say it was about 1 million men that went to battle for him. And something happened between either the people of Israel or the army. We're not sure what the sin was, but there was a great sin committed. And it grieved God. And it was the nation of Israel who's supposed to be a holy people. And God held him accountable. David was accountable for this sin. So he put a curse. He put a judgment on David and Israel. So we don't know what that sin was, but one of the things it does say in the Bible is that he took a census of the army. And it appears that, we see God fight battles for us with very little defenses around us. Jesus' battles were done with God. He didn't need the disciples there. He didn't need really angels and a big army. God defended his son Jesus. And when Jesus went on the cross, it was the Father who we cried out to. And so the same thing here. He wanted David to trust him. And David did at times, but at other times he didn't. This is one of the times that he did not. So he went and he took a census, and he himself got together 800 to about 1 million men, if not more. And that angered God because he didn't trust God for his battle. So that's something that's, we can't understand the mind of God and the mystery. You would think that it'd be okay to have a big army. But with David and him, it was personal. And we can't question when God, wants you to do something, you have to be obedient. So he does put a curse. He gives him an ultimatum. And he gives him 3 choices here. We can find it in 2 Samuel 24. I'm going to read it to you here. He says, David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men. And he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. So one would think, not a big deal. He wanted a big army and he took a census and counted the men. Well, for God, it was a problem. And David was convicted. And again, we see David's heart. He's not running away. He's not in denial. He's facing it. This is a great example for us. When we do wrong, to face our wrongdoing. And you see here his heart. You see here confessing. And his conscience really struck him. It says he was conscience-stricken. So in verse 11 it says, before David got up the next morning, the word of the Lord had come to Gad, the prophet, David's overseer. He said, go and tell David, this is what the Lord says. I am giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you. So what were those 3? In the Old Testament, it was either famine, sword, would be, military, you die by the sword, or plague. So he says to him, I choose the 3rd option. So he chooses the 3rd option. He says here in verse 14, he says, David said to Gad, I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great. Do not let me fall into human hands. So he's even acknowledging, I don't want to give the option for the sword. I don't want man to kill me. I'm accountable to God. This is what David says. So I'll take the 3rd option. He says, so the Lord sent a plague on Israel from that morning and unto the end of the time designated, and 70,000 of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. When the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, now it's going to go further, the Lord relented. In other words, the Lord was grieved. And that's what that word means in the Hebrew. Concerning the disaster, and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, enough. Withdraw, he says. Withdraw your hand. The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of the Arana the Jebusite. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I have sinned. I, the shepherd, have done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hands fall on me and my family. So he goes on, and he is even more obedient. He builds an altar. And God then stops the judgment. It could have been really bad for David. He should have been struck dead. But the Lord relented and did not. So this now takes us to, you can read more of that in chapter 24, the rest of that story, because we're pressed for time. But I'm going to go now to the Psalms, and now you see how that lines up with what we're studying here. This is now David's story. This is his grief. We see the story of his son here in Psalm 3. We see the story of the enemies and his own heart. So we start here in verse 3. So 3 things went down here in chapter 4, just to kind of summarize it. Number 1, he prays for preservation. So he wants God to preserve his, leadership and anything around that God has given him. He wants God to preserve his calling. So he prays for that. And you see how he calls out to the Lord. He says, answer me when I call to you, my righteous God. Give me relief from my distress. Remember earlier he said, I'm in distress. I've grieved greatly. I've sinned greatly. So that's the first thing. And then from verses 2 to 5 in chapter 4 of Psalm, he's reasoning with his enemies about repentance. So that's where you see here in verse 2 right up to 4, he's talking about the people of Israel and the armies. He says, how long will you love delusions and seek false gods? Know that the Lord has set apart his faithful servant for himself. So the Lord hears when I call for him. And then finally, it says, praising God for true perspective. Those are verses 6 through 8. You see now a focus on David. We'll read 6 through 8. He says, many, Lord, are asking, who will bring up prosperity? Who will bring us prosperity? Let the light of your face shine on us. Fill my heart with joy when their grain and new wine abound. They're talking about materialism. David is talking about spiritual things. And that's what he's trying to bring perspective to. He says, let the light of your face shine on us. Now that's a blessing that you hear in Deuteronomy and Numbers. These are blessings that they would pray. So David is reiterating that here. And finally he says, in peace I will lie down and sleep. For you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. So that's how he ends this. He goes back to God, gets restored, and this is how God restores us. When we could, echo that, and we can repeat this in whatever battle we have, if we can say, in peace I will lie down and sleep. For you alone, it's Christ alone. That's who gives us peace, safety, and we dwell with him. He says, when you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety. So that's the big message here. We'll do Psalm 5 for our next study. I'm sure glad that you got to spend this time with me. Whether it's your morning, your afternoon, or evening listening to this, may it greatly encourage you. I look forward to doing chapter 5 with you. We're learning a lot about David, but we're learning a lot of stuff from the Bible. And don't forget Sunday's message at noon. We got a powerful sermon coming right at you. It's your future home. I want to share with you what's coming for us Christians, our future home, and we'll be out of this mess pretty soon here. Okay, so stay with us here at Whit Love Ministries. Pastor Vi is saying, we love you here. Have a good night.